4 minutes after 8 o'clock. And if you have just joined us now, welcome to News and Views with me, Julie Ali. Our first guest is Dr. Rebecca Walker of the African Center for Migration and Society at Wits University. She says that South Africa has spent almost 300 million on the deportation of foreign nationals, with nearly 90,000 people removed as part of government's migration crackdown. However, Dr. Rebecca of the African Center for Migration and Society at Wits University questions whether the operation has actually addressed the problems it was intended to solve. Let's get talking with you, Dr. Rebecca Walker. Very good morning to you. Thank you for your welcome to Salam Media.
Good morning and morning to your listeners.
So, Dr. Walker, why do you say that deportations have worsened South Africa's socio-economic situation?
So, the reason I say it's worsened is we need to start by thinking about who or what exactly was removed. So, when we're told 292 million was spent on removing, that many migrants, we're talking about domestic workers, farm workers, construction workers, informal traders. These are people embedded in supply chains, households, and local economies. Their removal, does not create a job for a South African straight away. This, because the economy isn't, it's not a sum zero situation. Maybe there's a vacancy created. An employer who wanted cheap exploitable labor, however, will find the next exploitable worker. The household that needed childcare may go without childcare. The spaza shop that lost a supplier therefore loses income. So none of this shows up as a kind of successful metric for the government in terms of the economy. It actually moves through the economy and harms South Africans directly. And I think the line is that we disrupted an economy that was using people who were, directly linked into the economy in positive ways, as well as the so-called negative ways. We damaged regional relationships that the economy depends on. And most importantly, spent almost 300 million that we needed to fix the actual structural causes and structural problems in South Africa. And yet we have not changed a single underlying condition that caused what we call a migration crisis in the first place. So, and then finally, there's the opportunity cost. Home Affairs budgeted 60 million for this operation and then spent, almost 5 times that amount. And by the DG's own admission, that was outside of the legislative framework entirely. And the money didn't go to schools, it didn't go to clinics, it didn't go to fixing Home Affairs, the backlog and the challenges that not only undocumented migrants face, but South Africans face themselves. We know 13% of South Africans are undocumented because of those challenges in accessing documentation. So every rand spent was, primarily on a performance. It wasn't on the actual problems that were there in the first place.
A sad situation indeed. So you are suggesting that almost 90,000 people have been deported, but nothing has been achieved as far as we're concerned, as South Africa, as Home Affairs, as unemployed people.
Yeah, I think we have to ask what the measure of success was here, because if it was simply removing people and if it was a performance of, we are cracking down on migration, we're cracking down on migrants, then yes, something was achieved. But the measure of success was never clearly defined, which means that, the government can always say this operation was a success because the bigger the number they announce, the bigger they claim that they've achieved something, but that's not policy. The number tells us very little about, irregular migration itself, but a great deal about the scale of the operation. And really, the number is only as good as the method used to produce it. We don't know who established that these 90,000 people were undocumented, who verified their documentation, who checked their individual circumstances, who determined that that person who has been pulled out of their home in front of the community by not not necessarily an immigration officer by SAPS, or maybe March and March by Operation Dudula, who determined that they were undocumented, or perhaps they just couldn't produce their document at that moment. Perhaps they were waiting for Home Affairs to process and renew their visas, or they'd left their papers at home. We're just taking numbers and talking in very cold, hard, so-called facts about people's lives, these livelihoods that people have built up. And some of these families, their children have only ever known South Africa. South Africa is their home. And some families, there's not a clear-cut line you can draw between who is a migrant and who isn't a migrant, who's an undocumented migrant, who is a documented migrant. And of course, then there's the language of the illegal foreigner that's being used, which completely dehumanizes people. The minute you use illegality and start claiming that these, moving these people into sort of numbers, that's the minute you take away the human face of this whole process, which has been brutally violent in removing people from their homes and from their lives. So, if we want to say, yes, that it was a success in just removing that many people from the country, yes, that's been done. But, that doesn't tell us anything about, the process that happened, about the lives of those people, and about what I think will be a very clear negative impact on South Africa going forward.
And very sadly, the people on the ground, the South Africans, the very people that have been unemployed for the past many years, I think the thinking was that the moment they start getting deporting migrants, that they're going to be stepping into jobs. And I kind of wonder where and how does this thinking come about? And one also needs to question the type of messages that gets put out, that gets conveyed by March and March and Operation Dudula and such organizations, because it seems as if those organizations really create and cause more damage and harm to the country, to the economy, and raise expectations that are never going to ever be fulfilled.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think you've hit the nail on the head in terms of, the messages that are being shared, and the suggestion that somehow removing a group of people is going to improve the lives for South Africans is not only, misleading people, but it's incredibly dangerous. And then we can see that in history when you start scapegoating a particular group of people and claiming that they are responsible for the problems that others are facing. The solution then becomes to remove them. If we start with undocumented migrants, who do we go with next? And, we need to be clear that the evidence is unambiguous on unemployment. South Africa's unemployment is structural and requires structural solutions. It's been produced by an education system that does not produce employable graduates at scale that's needed, an economy that's not growing fast enough, and a small sector business that's strangled by, things like load shedding, collapsing municipal infrastructure. And there's been a history of economic exclusion that concentrates skill and capital. And what's being enforced is, pitting the poor against one another, removing a domestic worker or an informal trader or somebody who's fixing cars isn't going to suddenly open up the economy and address these factors. And yet, we leave those who are actually benefiting mostly in South Africa, those who are actually making money from exploitable employment, those who are really sitting on, the massive structural inequality in South Africa. They've been left completely alone. And instead, people who are desperate, people who just need something that they can kind of grasp onto in order to get their lives moving, are being spun these lies. And it's devastating, because it's, as I said, we've seen this before, but the government is also allowing this scapegoating to happen. They don't. Yes, there's condemnation of xenophobic actions, but there's nobody categorically standing up and saying migrants are not responsible for unemployment in South Africa. Removing a Malawian farm worker does not create a formal sector job for an unemployed South African graduate. And I think the key here that's also being missed is undocumented workers depress wages, not because of their presence, but because of their exploitability. They can't demand the minimum wage. They can't report abuse. They can't organize themselves because they have not been documented by the state, and often not for lack of trying. So the answer is not to remove them. It's removing their exploitability through regularization and documentation that actually will, benefit the economy overall for everybody. That raises the floor for every worker in the sector if we can, demand the minimum wage and ensure that is provided. But we've now run this experiment of removing, almost 90,000 people at the cost of 300 million, and the employment rate remains at the moment unchanged and is very likely to go up.
A very sad situation indeed. Let's continue this discussion right after the ad break. Please do stand by for us.
It's a wonder how kids get anything done these days. With all the distractions, when do they even get time to study? As a mother, all I can really do is make sure they have all they need to perform at their best. That's why I choose to include Sunfoil, triple refined pure sunflower oil with every meal I make. Naturally cholesterol-free and approved by the Heart and Stroke Foundation as part of a balanced eating plan. So whether I'm cooking, frying, or baking, I know every dish will be a wholesome one. Sunfoil, now we're cooking.
More than 800 million people around the world live in deep poverty, uncertain of where the next meal will come from. For those on the brink of starvation, a food pack means survival, dignity, and hope. Send food, send kindness. Be the reason a family does not go hungry. Donate now to Islamic Relief.
Discover the Africa of your dreams and surround yourself with her spectacular beauty. Relax beneath her serene sunsets and explore wildlife at its natural best. It's where the pride of Africa comes together. The Kwantu Private Game Reserve. Get to know the Big Five or cruise on an elephant safari game drive. Interact with lion and tiger cubs and enjoy world-class halal cuisine while we pamper you during your 5-star stay. Indulge in the true African experience. For reservations, call now on 042-203-1400 or visit kwantu.co.za. The Kwantu Private Game Reserve, the place of gathering.
Are you banking with convenience, transparency, and flexibility? With Al Baraka Bank's transactional banking account, you can enjoy convenient everyday banking designed around your needs. Benefit from zero fees on point-of-sale transactions and manage your banking easily through Al Baraka's secure mobile banking app and internet banking platform. From everyday payments to managing your personal or business banking, Al Baraka makes banking simple, transparent, and convenient. Visit albaraka.co.za to learn more. Al Baraka, your partner bank. Al Baraka Bank Limited is an authorized financial services and credit provider.
Tonight, a child in a shack will try to sleep through the cold. No heating, no insulation, just thin walls and a biting cold. African Muslims Agency is on the ground, reaching families in informal settlements across South Africa with blankets and winter essentials. Help us spread warmth this winter. For 180 Rand, give a blanket. For 360 Rand, a full winter pack. One gift, one less night in the cold. Africa Muslims Agency. Empowering, educating, inspiring.
Rejuvenating media day by day. This is Salam Media.
It is exactly 17 after 8 o'clock. Our guest is Dr. Rebecca Walker of the African Centre for Migration and Society at Wits. We are looking at the deportation drive under fire as South Africa's socio-economic crisis deepens. And back to you, Dr. Rebecca. We talked about the impact on this illegal migrant situation or the deportation that has already seen 90,000 people that have gone back to their home countries. We're not even sure if that is an accurate figure, but be that as it may, and the fact that there is so much of frustration on the ground by locals still out of job. I think it was almost assumed that the moment the first lot of migrants are shipped out, jobs will automatically become available. That has not happened. And it seems that these organizations are now targeting other groups, other minority groups. I've already heard about anti-Muslim or Islamophobic, you know, uh, Islamophobic suggestions, people saying and suggesting that you're the next group that we are coming after. That's very, very scary, because where and when and how is it ever going to stop?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly the point, that the minute you start sort of, suggesting that the removal of one particular group is going to improve the lives for another particular group, then you have to start asking, where do you draw the line? Because as you said, for one day it's one group of people, the next day it's another group of people. And, it's, as I've already pointed out, the line between those who are undocumented and those who are documented is a very difficult one, because it's a gray area. I mean, it's very rare that someone is choosing to be without documentation in South Africa. You basically can't do anything. You can't open a bank account. You have to live your life in the shadows because of the threat that's always hanging over your head. But the majority of people are undocumented because they cannot access documentation. Many come in documented and are rendered undocumented by the state itself. We know the state that Home Affairs is in. We know the backlog that, the UN itself has said it will take about 68 years to clear. We know that, there's a huge amount of corruption from inside of Home Affairs itself. And yet somehow we are turning around and saying to migrants without documents, it's entirely your fault that you don't have documents. You're criminals. You need to get out of the country. And the minute we sort of simplify a very complex debate and discussion, the minute we simplify it to that people are somehow illegal, somehow criminal, and we reduce their dignity by saying that, we say you're expendable, we need to get rid of you. The minute we do that, we're on a very, very dangerous path. And we've seen that before in South Africa's history. We've seen it before in global history, that the minute you dehumanize people and take away sort of an understanding of their lives, their livelihoods, the decisions they may have made, the connections, the networks they have, the minute you take that all away, it's very easy to just reduce it to numbers, and taking, you reduce this many people, somehow it's going to improve the lives of others. But I think we also have to understand where this comes from. And this is where, organizations like March and March have capitalized, because people are frustrated. People are angry, and justifiably so. The live realities of those, who are on the breadline, those who are really, fighting to get somewhere in life, to be able to get a job, even the most basic of work, they need answers, they want responses, and they need solutions, and they're not getting them from the government. So then we have these organizations who step in and say, well, we can give you not only a solution, but we can tell you who's responsible for it. And they point the finger, and then we suddenly have this, let's all go and, root out these undocumented migrants from communities, from their homes, and chase them out of South Africa, and suddenly your lives are going to improve. And it's tragic that lie is being, sold, and through the power of social media has been generated and regenerated, and it, is being pushed forward. And the government's done very little to counter that. And in fact, on many occasions, justifies it through its own statements or through its own movements, and particularly through this recent, removal of so many people from South Africa.
And the sad reality is these organizations that spring up overnight are definitely being funded by a third force. And the heads of these organizations are living very soft, because they're being paid huge amounts of money to continue with the destabilization in this regard. And once they succeed, let's hope and pray that common sense does prevail. But should they succeed regarding deportation of migrants, you kind of wonder what next, what's the next point on their agenda. But be that as it may, I kind of wonder what happens to migrants after they are deported.
So, I mean, that's a really important question. And it's one the government has almost entirely failed to answer. You know, for many, return means going back to the conditions that drove them to come to South Africa in the first place: poverty, instability, limited opportunity. You know, the structural conditions on both sides of the border are unchanged by removing so many people. Which is why the question, will they come back, which is how it's usually framed, you know, it misses the point entirely. Movement is not a risk to be managed. It's a given, right? Migration is a historical, it is historically has shaped South Africa. South Africa was built on migration. You know, people always move. People cross borders before borders existed. And we know that like 3 times as many people move within South Africa than they do across the borders. So it's a given. But the question always comes down to, how do we somehow manage this? And for those who've been in South Africa for years, who've built lives, whose children were born here, return means family separation, lost livelihoods. You know, communities have been disrupted on both sides of the border. I mean, I sometimes think about when the schools opened up again after the July holidays, you know, how many chairs were empty, how many children were missing. And yet this lie is spun that somehow by removing those children, the education system has been improved. And we have to ask, you know, have those schools with pit toilets has that changed? Have those schools where children are cramped into classrooms changed? No. What you've done is you've taken children away whose entire lives existed in South Africa, who only knew South Africa, and told them that they don't belong. And, you know, for asylum seekers and refugees, that's a particular issue, because return can mean returning to persecution. And South Africa has an obligation under the Refugee Convention of non-refoulement, which means you cannot return somebody to a country where they face persecution. So, and we know from, you know, people who've been working at the processing camps that people with documentation were returned. We know people, you know, it wasn't that everybody returned without documentation. The government can't show that to us. We know people who had visas, who had permits, who had asylum seeker permits and refugee permits have gone. And so what has now happened to them? We don't know, but we can't assume that it's, you know, it's not our problem. And I think that's what's one of the saddest things, is this rhetoric that's being sort of shared, is that, you know, it's not our concern. These people have gone. We shouldn't care about them. That's their problem. Send them back because it's not South Africa's problem. And that's devastating. One, because, you know, South Africa through apartheid was supported by the very countries that, you know, we are now targeting. You know, we haven't seen Zimbabwe or Malawi or any of these countries invoice South Africa for, you know, protecting those who had to leave the country during apartheid, who were part of the ANC and part of the MK. You know, these are countries that we had strong relationships with and a reciprocal understanding of humanity and support. And yet now, you know, we're suddenly saying that it doesn't matter. We don't care about these people because it only matters what happens in South Africa, as if South Africa is somehow this separate country that has nothing to do with any part of the region. And we're going to see a huge backlash. I mean, we've already seen it, but we're going to see more of that, because we are, you know, South Africa is currently holds the SADC chair. We want to promote regional economic cooperation. We want to improve trade. And yet we've just invoiced Malawi, a country that is one of the poorest countries in the world, for forcibly returning people to Malawi from South Africa, from a mess that we have created. And now we sent them an invoice for it. I mean, the offense that is being caused by that, but the sheer inhumanity of it as well, is actually, you know, really shocking. And it's, you know, I would, you know, to think of what's happened to people who've been forced out, and then, you know, to try and counter that argument that it doesn't matter is, you know, I think one of the most important things that we should be dwelling on at the moment.
So clearly this is going to have or already has had a huge impact on relations with neighboring countries. Having said that, Dr. Rebecca, where is government getting its migration policy wrong, and what should our government be doing be doing differently?
So there's kind of three fundamental ways, and none of what I'm saying is to say that we shouldn't manage migration. You know, every country has a right to control its borders, to manage migration. But first of all, the government is confusing performance with policy. So using an operation that costs 5 times its budget, run outside of the legislative framework by the DG's own admission, producing no bilateral agreements, no reformed home affair, and no regulation pathway. You know, that's a political response to a political moment. And we must remember this is an election year as well. So performance and policy are not the same thing. But second, the government's asking the wrong questions. The question the government's been asking is, how do we remove undocumented people? The question it should be asking is, how do we build a migration system that is orderly, documented, rights respecting, and economically rational? And these lead to completely different interventions. So the first leads to where we are, you know, 292 million removals spent on removals, and with no positive results. The second solution leads to bilateral agreements, home affairs reform, and a regularization pathway. And we know from other countries, by regularizing people's documentation, you're not suddenly massively increasing documentation, the number of migrants coming in. You're not suddenly, skewing the numbers there. What you're doing is allowing those who are already there, who are already here, who are already working, allowing them to become legal. Many of them would probably then choose to leave South Africa due to the way they've been treated, but it's treating people as human beings. And I think third is the most dangerous failure is, there is a point where immigration management quietly becomes population management. And I think you've been pointing at this. When you stop asking who is undocumented and start asking, where are the Zimbabweans, which I've heard a lot recently, because they're saying, so many Malawians were returned, why not the Zimbabweans? When you start asking about particular groups, one is a legal question about documentation, who's been returned, but the other is about nationality. And when our operation begins demanding that every Zimbabwean must then leave, regardless of their documentation, we then need to be asking, is this still about irregular migration, or has it become about foreign nationals simply being foreign? Is it about the way you walk, the way you talk, the way you dress? So the government's not getting migration policy wrong through incompetence. It's making a very political choice here to perform toughness and to look like it's doing something rather than to build a system. And that choice has a cost. And it's not just migrants that are paying for it, it's South Africans that are paying for it as well.
And that's where we leave it. Dr. Rebecca Walker of the African Centre for Migration and Society. But thank you indeed for your insights on this very volatile matter currently playing out in our country. Thank you once again, and God bless.
Many thanks.
It is exactly 8:31 a.m. News and Views on Salam Media. We're going for a break, and when we come back, we're going to be crossing over to Zambia to find out just exactly what's happening there regarding the suspension of their vote count. So do stay with us.
The following